The snow was supposed to bury them. That was the assumption in Moscow when the first Soviet artillery shells tore across the Finnish border on November 30th, 1939. The leadership in the Kremlin did not expect a drawn-out war. They did not expect resistance that would shock the world. They expected a small nation on the edge of Europe to fold under pressure. They expected Finland to break. The calculation seemed simple: a superpower with millions of soldiers against a country of fewer than 4 million people. Thousands of tanks against a defense force that barely had any. Endless artillery against thin lines of bunkers in frozen forests. In Moscow, maps were already being redrawn, but in the deep forests of Karelia and along the narrow roads cutting through snowbound wilderness, something happened that no one in the Soviet High Command had truly prepared for. The small nation did not break. To understand why Stalin believed Finland would collapse so easily, we need to step back more than 2 decades to a moment when empires were falling apart. In 1917, as revolution tore through the Russian Empire, Finland declared independence. For centuries it had been first part of Sweden, then an autonomous Grand Duchy under Russian rule. But when the Romanov dynasty fell and chaos spread through Petrograd, Finland seized its opportunity. Independence was declared in December 1917. The new Bolshevik government, fighting its own civil war, formally recognized Finland's sovereignty. On paper, the matter was settled. But on a strategic level, it never truly was. Finland's border sat dangerously close to Leningrad. In some areas, the distance between Finnish territory and Leningrad was barely 30 kilometers. In an age of artillery and aircraft, that distance felt dangerously small. As the 1930s unfolded and Europe drifted toward catastrophe, Soviet leadership became increasingly obsessed with security. Nazi Germany was expanding aggressively. Poland was vulnerable. The Baltic states were small and exposed. Stalin feared encirclement, invasion, betrayal. Geography became paranoia. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Baltic states, Eastern Poland, and Finland were placed within the Soviet sphere. Finland had not agreed to this arrangement, but its fate was now being discussed in rooms it had no access to. In October 1939, Soviet representatives summoned Finnish negotiators to Moscow. The demands were framed as reasonable security measures. The Soviet Union wanted to push the Finnish border further away from Leningrad. It wanted to lease the Hanko Peninsula as a naval base. It wanted several islands in the Gulf of Finland. In exchange, Finland would receive territory further north in Soviet Karelia. On paper, it was a land swap. In reality, it was a test of sovereignty. The Finnish leadership understood what had just happened to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Those countries had accepted Soviet bases under similar pressure. Soon after, their independence effectively disappeared. If Finland allowed Soviet troops onto its soil, it would be only a matter of time. The Finnish negotiators stalled. They offered compromises. They suggested alternative border adjustments. But they refused the core demand that would leave their southern defenses exposed and Soviet forces positioned deep inside their territory. In Moscow, this resistance was interpreted not as resolve, but as foolishness. The Red Army had recently participated in the invasion of eastern Poland. It was enormous, equipped with thousands of tanks and aircraft. On paper, it was one of the most powerful military forces in the world. Finland's entire army could barely muster 300,000 men, many of them reservists, farmers, factory workers, students. Stalin and his generals expected the campaign to last perhaps 2 weeks. There was another assumption underlying the military calculations. Soviet leadership believed Finland was internally divided. The scars of the Finnish Civil War of 1918 had not fully healed. Reds had fought Whites in a brutal conflict that left deep political and social wounds. The Kremlin believed that once Soviet troops crossed the border, Finnish workers would rise against their government. A puppet government was already prepared in exile, led by Finnish communist Otto Wille Kuusinen. Moscow announced this so-called Finnish Democratic Republic as the legitimate authority. The idea was clear. Finland would fracture from within. It did not. When Soviet bombs fell on Helsinki and other cities on November 30th, 1939, something unexpected happened. Instead of division, there was unity. Former Reds and Whites stood side by side. Political rivalries were set aside. The war was no longer about policy disagreements or party lines. It was about survival. At dawn, Soviet forces advanced along multiple fronts. Hundreds of thousands of troops crossed into Finnish territory in the opening phase. Tanks rolled forward. Artillery pounded defensive positions. Bombers targeted infrastructure and cities. The world watched as a superpower invaded a small democracy. On the Karelian Isthmus, Finland's main defensive position was the Mannerheim Line, named after the country's commander-in-chief, Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. It was not an impenetrable wall. It was a network of bunkers, trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions carefully placed along key terrain. It was built to delay, not to defeat an overwhelming force outright. When Soviet units attacked in early December, they expected rapid breakthroughs. Instead, they encountered stiff resistance, well-camouflaged positions, and precise defensive fire. Then the cold intensified. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was brutally harsh. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, lubricants thickened, weapons malfunctioned. Frostbite spread through ranks of soldiers who had not been properly equipped for extreme conditions. The Finnish soldiers, by contrast, were accustomed to winter. They wore white camouflage that blended into the snow. They moved swiftly on skis through forests that Soviet troops struggled to navigate. Instead of engaging in large-scale conventional battles whenever possible, the Finns used the terrain to their advantage. Soviet strategy relied heavily on roads, which cut through dense forests like narrow corridors. Long columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry stretched for kilometers. The Finns identified these columns as vulnerabilities. They developed and refined a tactic known as moti. The word originally referred to a pile of firewood cut into manageable pieces. In military terms, it meant dividing a large enemy formation into smaller, isolated pockets. Finnish units would cut supply lines, block roads, and isolate segments of Soviet columns. Once separated, these pockets could be surrounded and attacked individually. In places like Suomussalmi and along the Rate Road, entire Soviet divisions were encircled in freezing forests. Tanks stood abandoned. Vehicles were left stuck in snowdrifts. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, captured, or froze to death. The victories were astonishing. International newspapers began reporting on the resilience of the Finnish defense, the image of a tiny nation standing against a giant captured global imagination. Volunteers from other countries expressed interest in joining the fight. The League of Nations condemned the Soviet invasion and expelled the Soviet Union from its ranks. In Moscow, the situation was becoming uncomfortable. Casualties were far higher than expected. Coordination had been poor. Many experienced officers had been purged during Stalin's political cleansings in the late 1930s, leaving the Red Army weakened at the leadership level. The assumption of an easy victory was unraveling. But Stalin did not abandon the campaign. Instead, he adjusted. Reinforcements poured toward the Finnish front. Command structures were reorganized. Artillery preparation became more systematic and overwhelming. The Red Army began to adapt its tactics, learning from early failures. Finland had demonstrated extraordinary resilience, but resilience alone could not manufacture tanks. It could not replace artillery shells indefinitely. It could not erase the imbalance in manpower and industrial capacity. By January 1940, the war had already shattered the illusion of effortless Soviet dominance. The world had witnessed a small nation refuse to bend. The myth of instant collapse was gone. Stalin had expected Finland to break. It had not, and the price of that defiance was about to rise even higher. By January 1940, the war had entered a new phase. The early shock had passed. The world had seen the frozen forests swallow entire Soviet divisions. It had seen images of white-clad Finnish soldiers moving silently through snow like ghosts. It had read headlines about a small democracy defying a giant. But admiration did not change the balance of power. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin was furious. The Red Army had been humiliated. The international embarrassment was significant. Casualty reports were staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers had already been killed, wounded, or captured in just weeks of fighting. Yet retreat was never an option. Prestige mattered. If the Soviet Union failed to subdue Finland, it would signal weakness to the world, and especially to Adolf Hitler. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had bought time, but trust between dictators was fragile. A failed campaign in Finland could invite future aggression. So the Soviet response was not withdrawal, it was escalation. In February 1940, the Red Army launched a massive offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. This time it was different. Lessons from December had been absorbed. Coordination between artillery and infantry improved. Tanks were deployed with greater caution. Engineers worked systematically to clear obstacles. Most importantly, artillery fire became relentless. For days, Finnish defensive positions were subjected to crushing bombardment. Shell after shell tore into bunkers, trenches, and fortifications along the Mannerheim line. Concrete cracked, timber splintered, communication lines were severed. The earth itself seemed to shake without pause. The Finnish defenders endured as long as they could. They were exhausted, supplies were thinning, ammunition had to be rationed carefully, replacement troops were limited. Every loss mattered more for Finland than for the Soviet Union, and the sheer weight of numbers was becoming overwhelming. When Soviet forces achieved a breakthrough in mid-February near Suma, the defensive line that had held through December and January began to unravel. The Mannerheim line had never been meant to hold forever. It had been designed to delay and bleed an enemy. It had done that. But delay could not substitute for industrial capacity. The Finns fell back in disciplined stages, fighting stubborn rearguard actions. Villages were abandoned. Defensive positions were destroyed to prevent capture. Civilians fled westward in freezing conditions, leaving homes behind as Soviet troops advanced deeper into Karelia. The sense of isolation deepened. Finland had hoped for more substantial international intervention. Volunteers had arrived from Sweden and other countries, but large-scale military assistance never materialized. Western powers debated sending expeditionary forces, but strategic calculations and competing priorities delayed decisive action. In the end, Finland stood largely alone. Inside Helsinki, the leadership faced a brutal calculation: continue fighting and risk total collapse, or negotiate while the army still existed as a coherent force. Mannerheim understood the limits. He had seen his soldiers perform extraordinary feats. He had seen farmers halt tank columns and ski patrols dismantle entire regiments. But he also saw the casualty lists. He saw the ammunition stockpiles dwindling. He saw Soviet reinforcements arriving in numbers Finland simply could not match. Stalin, meanwhile, was determined to finish what he had started. The Red Army continued pressing forward with overwhelming firepower. Casualties remained high on both sides, but the scale of Soviet resources began to tell. Finnish units were forced into increasingly precarious positions. By early March 1940, Soviet forces were approaching Viipuri, one of Finland's largest and most important cities in the east. The threat of a full breakthrough toward the heartland was real. Negotiations quietly resumed. On March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. The ceasefire took effect the following day at 11 in the morning. The terms were harsh. Finland was forced to cede roughly a tenth of its territory, commonly cited as between 9 and 11%. This included large parts of Karelia, the city of Viipuri, areas along Lake Ladoga, parts of Sala, and islands in the Gulf of Finland. The Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviet Union as a naval base. Around 430,000 Finnish civilians, roughly 12% of the population, were displaced from their homes. They left with what they could carry. It was not an orderly migration. It was an evacuation under pressure. Trains were packed. Roads were crowded with sleds and carts. Families carried furniture, livestock, tools, and photographs. Farmhouses were set on fire so they would not shelter advancing troops. Cemeteries were abandoned, churches emptied. It was not just land that was lost. It was memory. And memory has weight. In Karelia, entire towns emptied in a matter of days. Families who had lived on the same land for generations dismantled their own lives piece by piece. Windows were boarded, doors were locked for the last time. Some homes were marked so neighbors would know who had passed through safely. Others were burned deliberately, flames rising into the winter sky as a final act of denial. Livestock was herded west through snow that reached the knees. Cows and horses struggled along frozen roads beside sleds piled high with furniture, tools, and bedding. Children were wrapped in blankets and carried through wind that cut like glass. Elderly residents were lifted onto wagons because walking was no longer possible. There was no certainty waiting on the other side. The evacuees did not know where they would settle. Farms in western Finland had to be divided. Landowners were asked to share acreage. Houses were split to make room for unfamiliar families. Communities that had never met before were suddenly bound together by necessity. Resettlement was not seamless. It required compromise. It required patience. It required a nation to absorb nearly 500,000 displaced people while still recovering from war. Yet it happened. The Karelian evacuees carried more than possessions. They carried dialects, songs, recipes, church traditions, and stories tied to landscapes they would not see again. Karelia did not disappear from Finland. It moved west, embedded into new soil. For the Soviet Union, the campaign's public framing remained triumphant. The border was secured. Leningrad was safer. Strategic depth had been achieved. But within the officer corps, the experience lingered differently. Reports documented logistical breakdowns in extreme cold, command delays, rigid adherence to doctrine that failed in forest warfare. Units that had expected open maneuver found themselves confined to narrow roads flanked by unseen enemies. The Red Army had possessed overwhelming force. It had not possessed flexibility. That lesson would matter later. In the months following the war, Soviet planners examined not only what had gone wrong, but why a smaller opponent had inflicted such disproportionate damage. Winter clothing was standardized, training manuals were revised, greater emphasis was placed on coordination between branches. Finland had forced a reckoning. Back in Helsinki, reflection took a different form. Church services filled with mourners. Memorial stones were carved with names that would be read each year thereafter. War cemeteries became places of quiet pilgrimage. The cost of survival was not abstract. Every town had a list, every family had a story, and yet, amid the grief, something else hardened. The belief that unity had saved them. During the Civil War of 1918, neighbors had fought neighbors. Distrust had lingered for years. But in 1939, when the border was crossed, those divisions did not reopen. Instead, a shared external threat sealed them. This was not romantic nationalism. It was pragmatic solidarity. Farmers fought beside factory workers. Conservatives fought beside former socialists. The invasion simplified politics into a single question. Would Finland remain Finland? The answer had been uncertain in November. By March it was clearer. Not because Finland had won decisively, but because it had refused to disappear. For Stalin, the campaign was declared a victory. Soviet newspapers emphasized territorial gains. Propaganda minimized losses. The Red Army had pushed the border away from Leningrad. The objective had been achieved. But privately, lessons were being drawn. Modern estimates vary, but Soviet losses were immense. At least 120,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, with total casualties including wounded and missing often estimated above 300,000. Finnish losses, devastating for a nation of its size, were around 25,000 killed and more than 40,000 wounded. The world noticed the disparity. The Red Army's performance exposed serious weaknesses in training, leadership, and coordination. The purges of the late 1930s had removed thousands of experienced officers. Many replacements were inexperienced and hesitant to take initiative. After the war, the Red Army underwent significant reorganization and adjustments. Training intensified. Command systems were reviewed. Winter equipment was improved. Coordination between armor, artillery, and infantry was refined. Ironically, the resistance Finland offered forced adaptation. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler observed closely. German intelligence analyzed Soviet losses with fascination. Reports described tanks stalled in forests, divisions encircled by ski troops, massive casualties inflicted by a smaller opponent. The Red Army's difficulties contributed to German underestimation of Soviet strength, reinforcing dangerous assumptions about how quickly the Soviet Union might collapse under concentrated assault. That miscalculation would have catastrophic consequences the following year. For Finland, the end of the Winter War did not feel like closure. It felt like a pause. The displaced Karelians had to be resettled, farms had to be redistributed, infrastructure had to be rebuilt. The economy, strained by months of mobilization, struggled to recover. But the psychological transformation was profound. The divisions of 1918 had finally faded into something smaller than national survival. Workers and conservatives, former Reds and Whites, had fought together. That memory endured. Sisu was no longer just a word. It was a lived experience. The Finnish army had faced overwhelming numbers and refused to collapse. That mattered deeply in a nation that had spent centuries under larger powers. Still, realism remained. Military leaders understood that if the Soviet Union attacked again under better conditions, the outcome could be far worse. The Winter War had proven Finnish resilience, but it had also revealed limitations. Finland began quietly searching for security guarantees. Sweden remained neutral. Britain and France had shown sympathy, but little direct action. Germany, meanwhile, was rising rapidly across Europe. When Nazi forces launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finland faced another brutal decision. The Soviet Union bombed Finnish cities again in late June. Within days, Finland entered what it called the Continuation War, fighting alongside Germany but pursuing its own objectives. For many Finns, this was not ideological alignment with Nazism. It was an opportunity to regain lost territory. The scars of the Winter War were still fresh. Karelia was still gone. Families still lived as internal refugees. The memory of 1939 shaped 1941. History is rarely simple. Finland did not defeat the Soviet Union outright in 1940. It did not escape unscathed. It lost territory and lives. It faced destruction. But it had survived. And survival mattered. If Finland had broken in December 1939, the map of Northern Europe might have changed permanently. The Baltic states had accepted Soviet bases under pressure in 1939. Within a year, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were annexed into the Soviet Union. Political leaders were arrested. Deportations followed. Independence vanished for decades. Finland narrowly avoided that fate. That is why the Winter War occupies such a powerful place in Finnish national memory. It was not a sweeping military victory. It was not a favorable peace. It was not even a war that ended on Finland's terms. But it preserved sovereignty, and that distinction changed everything that followed. In the forest of Suomussalmi, long after the fighting ended, the snow covered frozen equipment and fallen soldiers alike. Along the shattered fortifications of the Mannerheim Line, broken bunkers stood as silent witnesses to artillery that had shaken the ground for days without pause. On the Rate Road, destroyed vehicles rusted slowly beneath drifting snow. The war lasted 105 days. Yet those 105 days altered European history. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union in December 1939 for its aggression, one of its final significant acts before global war overtook diplomacy. International sympathy for Finland was strong. Volunteers arrived from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Hungary, and even the United States. Public opinion in Britain and France favored intervention, but logistical realities and competing priorities prevented large-scale deployment. Finland stood mostly alone, and still it held. Military historians continue to debate casualty figures and operational details. Soviet records were inconsistent and often politically filtered. Modern scholarship places Soviet deaths at well over 100,000, with total casualties, including wounded and missing, far higher. For Finland, roughly 25,000 dead in a nation of fewer than 4 million meant nearly every community felt loss personally. Small villages lost entire generations of young men. Yet despite devastation, the army never disintegrated. The government never collapsed. The social fabric did not tear apart. Stalin's fundamental miscalculation was not simply about terrain or temperature. It was about will. He believed Finland's internal divisions would resurface under pressure. He believed fear would outweigh unity. He believed that overwhelming force would produce rapid submission. Instead, the invasion unified a divided society. It hardened national identity. it transformed political adversaries into comrades in the same trenches. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that even overwhelming military power does not automatically guarantee obedience. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was better prepared than it had been in 1939. Some of those improvements stemmed directly from lessons learned in Finland. Defensive tactics were refined. Winter equipment was improved. Leadership gaps were addressed. The humiliation of the Winter War forced adaptation. History is filled with ironies. Finland's resistance may have contributed indirectly to strengthening the very army it had fought. Yet that irony does not diminish what happened in those forests. Picture a Soviet column advancing through dense pine woods. Engines growling, metal grinding against ice, snow falling silently from branches shaken by vibration. Then the column halts. A tree lies across the road. Before engineers can clear it, gunfire erupts from both sides. White figures move between trunks. Ski tracks disappear into the forest. Communication fractures. Panic spreads. Hours later, the column is no longer a column. It is fragments. That was Motti. That was asymmetry in motion. The Winter War became a case study in how smaller forces can exploit terrain and climate against larger mechanized armies. Military academies still analyze the campaign today. But beyond tactics, the war was psychological. The Soviet Union learned that invasion would not always produce instant obedience. The world learned that small states could resist even when abandoned by geography and outmatched by numbers. Finland learned something deeper. It learned its limits, and it learned its strength. After the Second World War ended in 1945, Finland faced the Soviet Union again. This time not across a frozen battlefield, but at a negotiating table. War reparations were imposed. Political pressure remained constant. The country adopted a careful foreign policy, balancing sovereignty with pragmatic accommodation of its powerful neighbor. That delicate balancing act lasted decades, but it was possible only because Finland had not been absorbed in 1940. The winter of 1939 proved something fundamental. Independence is not guaranteed by treaties alone. It is not guaranteed by sympathy from abroad. It is not guaranteed by geography. Sometimes it must be defended in temperatures that freeze breath in mid-air, in forests where visibility is measured in meters, by citizens who understand that surrender does not always bring safety. Joseph Stalin expected Finland to break quickly, cleanly, predictably. He expected internal collapse. He expected military superiority to translate into political obedience. He was wrong. Finland bent under artillery. It retreated under pressure. It ceded land, but it did not break. And in that distinction lies the difference between a conquered territory and a sovereign state that survives, rebuilds, and writes its own future. The snow did not bury Finland. It buried certainty. And long after the guns fell silent, that winter remained a warning to every empire that mistakes size for inevitability. Stalin expected Finland to break. It never did.